Beehive ovens have been around for centuries. They were with us during the Roman eras, and you even found it in the Pompeii ruins. This continued to travel throughout Europe, but we brought the Beehive oven from England here to America. And Beehive ovens were used to cook 2 weeks worth of baking at a time. You wouldn't have fired up an oven this large just to do a loaf of bread like we're going to do today. That we have a fire burning inside the Beehive oven. I'm not turning on a knob, I'm not adjusting the temperature. We build the fire in the oven so that all the ambient heat will heat up the base of the oven as well as all the bricks surrounding and enclosing the oven. When you want to figure out how hot is it inside, you actually feel the bricks on the outside. For every brick, it's approximately 100 degrees inside the oven. And if I can put my hand on it, right now we're about at 75 degrees inside that oven when you consider how cold it's been. But this is the first time this season that we're firing up the brick oven. In traditional bread making, you would create a sponge that could sit up to 24 hours in advance. For today's purposes, I'm actually doing a hybrid bread that will use both a sourdough starter as well as some instant yeast, so that it will only rest for about 20 minutes before I incorporate the salt. Salt is an inhibitor to yeast, and we want to have a nice, light, lively loaf. In the bowl, we have a combination of 1 cup of all-purpose flour and 3.5 cups of bread flour. If you don't have bread flour in your house and only all-purpose, I do recommend adding 3.5 teaspoons of gluten. That would provide the protein you need to get the lift out of your yeast and your starter. This is a starter that I have been using for the last 2 weeks to make pumpkin rye bread as well as sourdough bread. We're going to add 2 cups of water to it. And that was 2 cups of starter. Now my starter is relatively thin, so we might wind up adding a little more flour to the dough as we incorporate. Before I add my starter, I'm actually going to add my yeast and mix it together. Make a well in the center. And pour in your starter. Make sure you get all the starter, even the good bits on the bottom, okay? You can use your hands or you can use a spoon. If I'm at home, I'm guilty of using my hands. Today, we're using a spoon just for the sake of not looking like a monster with dough-covered hands. Though you know my hands will get in there at some point in time. The dough that we're looking for is going to be one that is very tacky and very light. So we are mixing from the sides in, making sure we incorporate all the flour that is sitting on the edges of the bowl. It's a gentle process. Bread making, like a lot of cooking, doesn't always have a scientific, there is a lot of science behind bread making, but during the colonial time frame and during the early years of the American Republic, nobody talked about the dough should be 75 degrees Celsius or Fahrenheit. It should weigh approximately this much, only 14 grams. Instead, they got so they would know what the feel, the look, and the eye would be. And that's what we were working with, and that's how I was first taught how to make bread. Not through a chemical equation, but through the texture and what the dough looked like. Right now, this dough, while the flour will continue to absorb moisture, is too wet. I'm going to add about a 1/4 cup or a handful over the top and incorporate it in. I will not add another cup until I stir it a little bit more. If you add too much flour, adding water will actually mess up your dough. So you're better off being frugal and how much flour you add. Here in shape, you can see that it's still a rough edge. It's not smooth and elastic like many a dough is, because we're going to let this set and we're going to add salt to the mixture. Even though there's a chicken screaming at me in the distance, even though we're a colonial cook, we still can touch our dough, and using our own body temperature, you know whether the dough is cooler than what you want. I like it to be a little warmer than what it is, about 70 degrees, but I'm not going to use a thermometer. Instead, I'm going to use my hand and give it a light touch, and it's cool to the touch. So what I'm going to do is, it has oil over the top of it, and we're just going to let it set over here in the sun for a little bit and allow Mother Nature to heat her up a little bit. Now what we're going to do is turn our loose dough out onto the cloth, which I floured, hope you noticed. And we can work on getting every bit if you have patience, but today I'm an impatient woman. So we're going to just take that much. And we're going to flavor the dough. Normally, you don't add salt until after your yeast and starter have been active. What I have in this plate is 2 teaspoons of salt, and I'm going to add just a little bit for good luck. And what we're going to do is start to lightly knead this and hold the dough together. If your hands get too dough encrusted, just rub them on the cloth. What you're doing is activating the gluten, which is in the flour, and that's what the yeast feeds on. Every time the yeast eats, it produces a gas. The gas is what makes the bubbles in bread. So when you have a piece of sourdough bread, you've had an awful lot of gas. Think of it as cows for the world. We're going to shape our bread. That has been rising. I'm going to use the by eye method of dividing in half. And you can see how clingy the bread is. And we're going to tuck the seam at the bottom. That was horrible. Now these are 2 very wet sourdoughs. We're going to let it proof. So we're going to cover the doughs, allow them to rest for about an hour. And prior to putting them in the Beehive oven, I will take a razor blade and score them with an X so that the doughs can rise and bloom. And it goes back to manual labor. We're going to actually scrape the coals out of the oven. To do that, I'm going to do what looks like a baker's scythe, and I will hold on to the coals and pull them, and then use the giant dustpan By the way, these were all made by our blacksmith here on site. Just a clear pathway to bake. I'm going to use a sorghum broom to sweep out the fire. And it has been soaking for the last couple of hours so that it will not catch on fire. What you have to make sure is that you don't flick hot ash on yourself. It'll do two things. You're going to clean the base of the floor, and you can see how quickly, and you're going to be building up steam to make a hot, wet crust. What happens naturally in a Beehive oven is that the dough, there we go, is that the dough will have the moisture from the Beehive oven, opposed to in a domestic house, you would be using a spray bottle to create that same steamy event. Not only do we have the bricks to test with, but one of the tried and true methods is to take cornmeal or flour and cast it onto the floor of the oven. It allows you to tell where the hot spots and the cold spots are in the oven. Right now, we're pretty even temperatured. You can see right where our fire was, it's starting to go brown, but it's not going instantly black. If it was to go instantly black, you'd have to wait a little bit before you put your doughs in. Okay, we're ready to put our doughs into the oven. We're going to slide them into the center of the oven. I'm going to push it back a little bit, pardon me for leaning in, and I'm using the most easily available pusher I have. And that should cook for about 45 minutes. Well, it's been about 45 minutes. It's time to check the bread. We haven't opened the door since we put the bread in. One of the things that happens naturally in the Beehive oven is that the temperature will drop. So from 450 degrees down to approximately 400 degrees in the half an hour cook time. If you look at modern recipes, frequently they'll use that exact same technique by having you manually change the temperature on the oven. Let's see what we have. Oh, you should smell it. Fresh dough right from the oven. Now, I would let it normally come on a rack, but today I didn't bring a rack, so what I'm going to do is let it rest on a towel and allow it to cool. That will keep the crust hard and it being a nice chewy bite. Thank you for coming and joining us today at historic Cold Spring Village. Next time, we'll be doing a very old-fashioned peasant bread, which was what almost everybody here at the village would have eaten. Rye, corn, and a little bit of very expensive wheat flour.